Hey there. Happy Monday. Welcome back to the Aurora Bedtime Story Project. I'm Chris Voss, and we do this every weeknight at 9:30 right here from the beautiful Canopy Room at Bone Market in Somerville. And as always, a big thank you to Leah Pringle who lets me use this space. It's generally an event space and open to all sorts of great events, concerts and poetry readings and children's story times and play times and all sorts of things. But being closed for the foreseeable future, she's very graciously let me record from here. So thank you, Leah. Thank you. We are on to the next two chapters of the Secret Garden, and tonight we are also going a little bit live from Instagram as well. Thought I'd try that out for another try, so doing that as well. So if you'll notice perhaps I'm switching back and forth with my eyeline. Well, that's why. Okay, before we get to the story, we do a deep breath every night just to get settled, get focused, and let's do it right now. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Chapter 15 of The Secret Garden, Nest Building. After another week of rain, the high arch of blue sky appeared again, and the sun which poured down was quite hot. Though there had been no chance to see either the secret garden or Dickon, Mistress Mary had enjoyed herself very much. The week had not seemed long. She had spent hours of every day with Colin in his room, talking about Rajas or gardens or Dickon and the cottage on the moor. They had looked at the splendid books and pictures, and sometimes Mary had read things to Colin, and sometimes he had read a little to her. When he was amused and interested, she thought he scarcely looked like an invalid at all, except that his face was so colorless and he was always on the sofa. "You are a sly young one to listen and get out of your bed to go following things up like you did that night," Mrs. Medlock said once. "But there's no saying it's not been a sort of blessing to the lot of us. He's not had a tantrum or a whining fit since you made friends. The nurse was just going to have up a case because she was sick of him. But she says she doesn't mind staying now you've done on duty with her," laughing a little. In her talks with Colin, Mary had tried to be very cautious about the secret garden. There were certain things she wanted to find out about him, but she felt that she must find them out without asking him direct questions. In the first place, as she began to like to be with him, she wanted to discover whether he was the kind of boy who could tell a secret to. He was not in the least like Dickon, but he was evidently so pleased with the idea of a garden no one knew anything about that she thought perhaps he could be trusted. But she had not known him long enough to be sure. The second thing she wanted to find out was this: if he could be trusted, if he really could, wouldn't it be possible to take him to the garden without having anyone find it out? The Grand Doctor had said that he must have fresh air, and Colin had said that he would not mind fresh air in a secret garden. Perhaps, if he had a great deal of fresh air, and knew Dickon and the robin, and saw things growing, he might not think so much about dying. Mary had seen herself in the glass sometimes lately when she had realized that she looked quite a different creature from the child that had arrived from India. This child looked nicer. Even Martha had seen a change in her. The air from the moor has done thee good already, she had said. Thou'rt not nigh so yeller, and thou'rt not so scrawny. E'en the hair is a slamp on the head so flat. It's got some life in it now, so as it sticks out a bit. It's like me, said Mary. It's growing stronger and fatter. I'm sure there's more of it. It looks it for sure, said Martha, ruffling it up a little round her face. Thou'rt not half so ugly when it's the way, and there's a bit o' red in the cheeks. If gardens and fresh air had been good for her, perhaps they could be good for Colin as well. But then if he hated people to look at him, perhaps he would not like to see Dickon. Why does it make you angry when you are looked at? She inquired one day. I always hated it, he answered, even when I was very little. Then, when they took me to the seaside, and I used to lie in my carriage, everybody used to stare, and ladies would stop and talk to my nurse, and then they would begin to whisper, and I knew when they were saying I shouldn't live to grow up. Then sometimes the ladies would pat my cheeks and say, poor child, and once, when a lady did that, I screamed out loud and bit her hand. She was so frightened she ran away. She thought you had gone mad like a dog, said Mary, not at all admiringly. I don't care what she thought, said Colin, frowning. I wonder why you didn't scream and bite me when I came into your room, said Mary. Then she began to smile slowly. I thought you were a ghost or a dream, he said. You can't bite a ghost or a dream, and if you scream, they don't care. Would you hate it if a boy looked at you? Mary asked uncertainly. He lay back on his cushion and paused thoughtfully. There's one boy, he said quite slowly, as if he were thinking over every word. There's one boy, I believe, I shouldn't mind. It's that boy who knows where the foxes live. Dickon. I'm sure you wouldn't mind him, said Mary. The birds don't, and the other animals, he said, still thinking it over. Perhaps that's why I shouldn't. He's a sort of animal charmer, and I'm a boy animal. Then he laughed, and she laughed too. In fact, it ended in their both laughing a great deal and finding the idea of a boy animal hiding in his hole very funny indeed. What Mary felt afterwards was that she need not fear about Dickon. On that first morning when the sky was blue again, Mary wakened very early. The sun was pouring in, slanting rays through the blinds, and there was something so joyous in the sight of it that she jumped out of bed and ran to the window. She drew up the blinds and opened the window itself, and a great waft of fresh, scented air blew in upon her. The moor was blue, and the whole world seemed as if something magic had happened to it. There were tender little fluttering sounds here and there and everywhere, as if scores of birds had begun flying up for a concert. Mary put her hand out of the window and held it in the sun. It's warm, warm, she said. It will make the green points push up and up and up, and it will make the bulbs and roots work and struggle with all their might under the earth. She kneeled down and leaned out of the window as far as she could, breathing big breaths and sniffing the air until she laughed because she remembered what Dickon's mother had said about the end of his nose quivering like a rabbit's. It must be very early, she said. The little clouds are all pink, and I've never seen the sky look like this. No one is up. I don't even hear the stable boys. A sudden thought made her scamper to her feet. I can't wait. I am going to see the garden. She had learnt to dress herself by this time, and she put on her clothes in 5 minutes. She knew a small side door which she could unbolt herself, and she flew downstairs in her stocking feet and put on her shoes in the hall. She unchained and unbolted and unlocked, and when the door was opened, she sprang across and stepped with one bound, and there she was, standing on the grass which seemed to have turned green, and with the sun pouring down on her, and warm, sweet wafts about her, and the fluting and twittering and singing coming from every bush and tree. She clasped her hands for pure joy, and looked up in the sky, and it was so blue and pink and pearly and white and flooded with springtime light that she felt she must flute and sing aloud herself, and she knew that thrushes and robins and skylarks could not possibly help it. She ran around the shrubs and paths toward the secret garden. It is all different already, she said. The grass is greener, and things are thicker. Up everywhere, sticking, are things uncurling, and green buds, and leaves are showing. This afternoon, I am sure, Dickon will come. The long, warm rain had done strange things to the herbaceous beds which bordered the walk by the lower wall. There were things sprouting and pushing out from the roots of clumps of plants, and there were actually here and there glimpses of royal purple and yellow unfurling among the stems of crocuses. 6 months before, Mistress Mary would not have seen how the world was waking up, but now she missed nothing. When she had reached the place where the door hid itself under the ivy, she was startled by a curious sound. It was the caw-caw of a crow, and it came from the top of the wall. And when she looked up, there sat a big, glossy plumage, blue blackbird, looking down at her very wisely indeed. She had never seen a crow so close before, and he made her a little nervous. But the next moment he spread his wings and flapped across the garden. She hoped he was not going to stay inside, and she pushed the door open, wondering if he would. When she got fairly into the garden, she saw that he probably did intend to stay, because he had alighted on a dwarf apple tree, and under the apple tree was lying a little reddish animal with a bushy tail, and both of them were watching the stooping body and rust-red head of Dickon, who was kneeling on the grass, working hard. Mary flew across the grass to him. "Oh, Dickon! Dickon!" she cried out. "How could you get here so early? How could you? The sun has only just got up." He got up himself, laughing and glowing, and tousled, his eyes like a bit of the sky. He said, "I was up long before him. How could I have stayed in bed? The world's all fair begun again this morning it has, and it's working and hummin' and scratching and piping and nest building and breathing out sense till you've got to be out on it stead of lying on your back. When the sun did jump up, the moor went mad for joy, and I was in the midst of the heather, and I run like mad myself, shouting and singing, and I come straight here. I couldn't have stayed away. Why, the garden was lying here, waiting." Mary put her hands to her chest, panting, as if she had been running herself. "Oh, Dickon, Dickon," she said, "I'm so happy I can scarcely breathe." Seeing him talking to a stranger, The little bushy-tailed animal rose from its place under the tree and came to him, and the rook, cawing once, flew down from its branch and settled quietly on his shoulder. "This is the little fox cub," he said, rubbing the little reddish animal's head. "It's named Captain. And this here's Soot. Soot, he flew across the moor with me, and Captain he run same as the hounds had been after him. They both felt same as I did." Neither of the creatures looked as if they were the least afraid of Mary. When Dickon began to walk about, Soot stayed on his shoulder, and Captain trotted quietly close to his side. "See here," said Dickon. "See how these has pushed up, and these, and these, and look at these here." He threw himself upon his knees, and Mary went down beside him. They had come upon a whole clump of crocuses burst into purple and orange and gold. Mary bent her face down and kissed them. "You never kiss a person in that way," she said when she lifted her head. "Flowers are so different." He looked puzzled, but smiled. He said, "I've kissed Mother many a time that way when I come in from the moor after a day's roaming, and she stood there at the door in the sun, looking so glad and comfortable." They ran from one part of the garden to another, and found so many wonders that they were obliged to remind themselves that they must whisper or speak low. He showed her swelling leaf buds on rose branches which had seemed dead. He showed her 10,000 new green points pushing through the mold. They put their eager young noses close to the earth, sniffed its warm springtime breathing. They dug and pulled and laughed low with rapture, until Mistress Mary's hair was as tumbled as Dickon's, and her cheeks were almost as poppy red as his. There was every joy on earth in the secret garden that morning, and in the midst of them came a delight more delightful than all, because it was more wonderful. Swiftly, something flew across the wall and darted through the trees to a close-grown corner, a little flare of red-breasted bird with something hanging from its beak. Dickon stood still and put his hand on Mary, almost as if they had suddenly found themselves laughing in a church. "We munnot stir," he whispered in a broad Yorkshire. "We munnot scarce breathe. I know he has mate hunting when I seed him last. It's Ben Weatherstaff's robin. He's building his nest. He'll stay here if us don't flight him." They settled down softly upon the grass and sat there without moving. "Us mustn't seem as if us watching him too close," said Dickon. "He'd be out with us for good if he got the notion us was interfering now. He'll be a good bit different till all this is over. He's setting up housekeeping. He'll be shyer and readier to take things ill. He's got no time for visiting and gossiping. Us must keep still a bit and try to look as if us was grass and trees and bushes. Then, when he's got used to seeing us, I'll chirp a bit, and he'll know us not to be in his way." Mistress Mary was not at all sure that she knew, as Dickon seemed to, how to try to look like grass and trees and bushes. But he had said the queer thing as if it were the simplest and most natural thing in the world, and she felt it must be quite easy for him, and indeed, she watched him for a few minutes carefully, wondering if it was possible for him to turn quietly green and put out branches and leaves. But he only sat wonderfully still, and when he spoke, dropped his voice to such a softness that it was curious that she could hear him at all. But she could. "It's part of the springtime, this nest building is," he said. "I warrant it's been going on in the same way every year since the world has begun. They've got their way of thinking and doing things, and the body had better not meddle. You can lose a friend in springtime easier than any other season if you're too curious." "If we talk about him, I can't help looking at him," Mary said as softly as possible. "We must talk of something else. Besides, there is something I want to tell you." "He'll like it better if us talks of something else," said Dickon. "What is it that's got to tell me?" "Well, do you know about Colin?" she whispered. Dickon turned his head to look at her. "What does thou know about him?" he asked. "I've seen him. I have been to talk to him every day this week. He wants me to come. He says I'm making him forget about being ill and dying," answered Mary. Dickon looked actually relieved as soon as the surprise died away from his round face. "I am glad of that," he exclaimed. "I'm right down glad. It's easier. I know I must say nothing about him, as I don't like having to hide things." "Don't you like hiding the garden?" said Mary. "I'll never tell about it," he answered. "But I says to Mother, 'Mother,' I says, 'I got a secret to keep. It's not a bad un, thou knows that. It's no worse than hiding where a bird's nest is. Thou doesn't mind, does thou?'" Mary always wanted to hear about Mother. "What did she say?" she asked, not at all afraid to hear. Dickon grinned sweet-temperedly. "It was just like her. What she said? She said, she give my head a bit of a rub and laughed and says, 'Eh, lad, that can have all the secrets thou likes. I knowed thee 12 year.'" "How did you know about Colin?" Mary asked. "Everybody knows about Master Craven, and knowed there was a little lad as was like to be cripple, and they knowed Master Craven didn't like him to be talked about. Folks was sorry for Master Craven, because Mrs. Craven was such a pretty young lady, and they was so fond of each other. Mrs. Medlock stops in our cottage whenever she goes to Thwaite, and she doesn't mind talking to Mother before us children, because she knows us to have been brought up to be trusty. How did thou find out about him?" "Martha was in fine trouble the last time she came home. She said she'd heard him. She said tha'd heard him fretting, and there was asking questions, and she didn't know what to say." Mary told her story about the midnight wuthering of the wind which had wakened her, and about the faint far-off sounds of the complaining voice which had led her down the dark corridors with her candle, and had ended with her opening of the door of the dimly lighted room with the cavern, four-poster bed in the corner. When she described the small ivory-white face and the strange black-rimmed eyes, Dickon shook his head. "Them's just like his mother's eyes, only hers was always laughing, they say," he said. "They say as Mr. Craven can't bear to see him when he's awake, and it's because his eyes is so like his mother's, and yet look so different in his miserable bit of face." "Do you think he wants him to die?" whispered Mary. "No, but he wishes he'd never been born. Mother, she says that's the worst thing on earth for a child. Them as is not wanted scarce ever thrives. Mr. Craven, He'd buy anything his money could buy for the poor lad, but he'd like to forget he's on earth. For one thing, he's afraid he'll look at him some day and find he's growed hunchback. Colin's so afraid of it himself that he won't sit up, said Mary. He says he's always thinking that if he could feel a lump coming, he should go crazy and scream himself to death. He oughtn't to lie there thinking things like that, said Dickon. No lad could get well as thought them sort of things. The fox was lying on the grass close by him, looking up to ask for a pat now and then, and Dickon bent down and rubbed his neck softly and thought a few minutes in silence. Presently he lifted his head and looked round the garden. When first we got here, he said, it seemed like everything was grey. Look round now and tell me if thou doesn't see a difference. Mary looked and caught her breath a little. Why, she cried, the grey wall is changing. It is as if a green mist were creeping over it. It's almost like a green gauze veil. Aye, said Dickon, and it'll be greener and greener till the grey all gone. Can thou guess what I was thinking? I know it was something nice, said Mary eagerly. I believe it was something about Colin. I was thinking that if he was out here, he wouldn't be watching for lumps to grow on his back. He'd be watching for buds to break on those rose bushes, and he'd likely be healthier, explained Dickon. I was wondering if us could ever get him in the humour to come out here and lie under the trees in his carriage. I've been wondering that myself. I've thought of it every time I've talked to him, said Mary. I've wondered if he could keep a secret, and I've wondered if we could bring him here without anyone seeing us. I thought perhaps you could push his carriage. The doctor said he must have fresh air, and if he wants us to take him out, no one dare disobey him. He won't go out with other people, and perhaps they will be glad if he will go out with us. He could order the gardeners to keep away so they wouldn't find out. Dickon was thinking very hard as he scratched Captain's back. It'd be good for him, I warrant, he said. Us not be thinking he'd better never been born. Us be just two children watching a garden grow, and he'd be another. Two lads and a little lass, just looking on at the springtime. I warrant it'd be better than doctor's stuff. He's been lying in his room so long, and he's always been so afraid of his back, that it has made him quite queer, said Mary. He knows a good many things about books, but he doesn't know anything else. He says he has been too ill too long to notice things, and he hates going out of doors and hates gardens and gardeners. But he likes to hear about this garden because it is a secret. I daren't tell him much, but he said he wanted to see it. Us'll have him out here some time for sure, said Dickon. I could push his carriage well enough. Has thou noticed how the robin and his mate has been working while we've been sitting here? Look at him, perched on the branch, wondering where it'd be best to put that twig he's got on his beak. Dickon made one of his low, whistling calls, and the robin turned his head and looked at him inquiringly, still holding his twig. Dickon spoke to him as Ben Weatherstaff did, but Dickon's tone was one of more friendly advice. Wherever thou puts it, he said, it'll be all right. Thou knew how to build the nest before thou come out the egg. Get on with thee, lad. Thou's got no time to lose. Oh, I do like to hear you talk to him, Mary said, laughing delightedly. Ben Weatherstaff scolds him and makes fun of him, but he hops about and looks as if he understood every word, and I know he likes it. Ben Weatherstaff says he is so conceited he would rather have stones thrown at him than not be noticed. Dickon laughed too, and went on talking. "Tha knows us won't be troubling thee," he said to the robin. "Us is near being wild things ourselves. Us is nest building too, bless thee. Look out, that doesn't tell on us." And though the robin did not answer because his beak was occupied, Mary knew that when he flew away with his twig to his own corner of the garden, the darkness of his dew-bright eye meant that he could not tell their secret for the world. Chapter 16. "I won't," said Mary. They found a great deal to do that morning, and Mary was late in returning to the house, and was also in such a hurry to get back to her work that she quite forgot about Colin until the last moment. "Tell Colin I can't come and see him yet," she said to Martha. "I'm very busy in the garden." Martha looked rather frightened. Miss Mary," she said, "it may put him all out of humour if I tell him that." But Mary was not afraid of him, as other people were, and she was not a self-sacrificing person. "I can't stay," she answered. "Dickon's waiting for me." And she ran away. The afternoon was even lovelier and busier than the morning had been. Already nearly all the weeds were cleared out of the garden, and most of the roses and trees had been pruned or dug out. Dickon had brought a spade of his own, and he had taught Mary to use all her tools, so that by this time it was plain that though the lovely wild place was not likely to become a gardener's garden, it would be a wilderness of growing things before the springtime was over. "There'll be apple blossoms and cherry blossoms overhead," Dickon said, working away with all his might. "And there'll be peach and plum trees blooming against the words like tiny streaks of lightning. Sometimes the rook flapped his black wings and soared away over the treetops in the park. Each time he came back and perched near Dickon and cawed several times, as if he were relating his adventures, and Dickon talked to him just as he had talked to the robin. Once, when Dickon was so busy that he did not answer him at first, Soot flew on his shoulder and gently tweaked his ear with his large beak. When Mary wanted to rest a little, Dickon sat with her under a tree, and once he took his pipe out of his pocket and played the soft, strange little notes, and 2 squirrels appeared on the wall and looked and listened. "That's a good bit stronger than thou was," Dickon said, looking at her as she was digging. "Thou's beginning to look different for sure." Mary was glowing with exercise and good spirits. "I'm getting fatter and fatter every day," she said, quite exultantly. "Mrs. Medlock will have to get me some bigger dresses. Martha says my hair is growing thicker. It isn't so flat and stringy." The sun was beginning to set and sending deep, gold-colored rays slanting under the trees when they parted. "It'll be fine tomorrow," said Dickon. "I'll be back at work by sunrise." "So will I," said Mary. She ran back to the house as quickly as her feet would carry her. She wanted to tell Colin about Dickon's fox cub and the rook, and about what the springtime had been doing. She felt sure he would like to hear. So it was not very pleasant when she opened the door of her room to see Martha standing, waiting for her with a doleful face. "What is the matter?" she asked. "What did Colin say when you told him I couldn't come?" Said Martha. "I wish tha'd gone. He was nigh going into one of his tantrums. There's been a nice to-do all afternoon to keep him quiet. He would watch the clock all of the time. Mary's lips pinched themselves together. She was no more used to considering other people than Colin was, and she saw no reason why an ill-tempered boy should interfere with the thing she liked best. She knew nothing about the pitifulness of people who had been ill and nervous, and who did not know that they could control their tempers and need not make other people ill and nervous too. When she had had a headache in India, she had done her best to see that everybody else also had a headache or something quite as bad. And she felt it was quite right. But of course now she felt that Colin was quite wrong. He was not on his sofa when she went into his room. He was lying flat on his back in bed, and he did not turn his head toward her when she came in. This was a bad beginning, and Mary marched up to him with her stiff manner. "Why didn't you get up?" she said. "I did get up this morning when I thought you were coming," he answered without looking at her. "I made them put me back in bed this afternoon. My back ached, and my head ached, and I was tired. Why didn't you come?" "I was working in the garden with Dickon," said Mary. Colin frowned and condescended to look at her. "I won't let that boy come here if you go and stay with him instead of coming to talk to me," he said. Mary flew into a fine passion. She could fly into a passion without making a noise. She just grew sour and obstinate and did not care what happened. "If you send Dickon away, I'll never come into this room again," she retorted. "You'll have to if I want you," said Colin. "I won't," said Mary. "I'll make you," said Colin. "They'll drag you in." "Shall they, Mr. Rajah?" said Mary fiercely. "They may drag me in, but they can't make me talk when they get me here. I'll sit and clench my teeth and never tell you one thing. I won't even look at you. I'll stare at the floor." They were a nice, agreeable pair as they glared at each other. If they had been two little street boys, they would have sprung at each other and had a rough-and-tumble fight. As it was, they did the next thing to it. "You're a selfish thing," cried Colin. "What are you?" said Mary. "Selfish people always say that. Anyone is selfish who doesn't do what they want. You're more selfish than I am. You're the most selfish boy I ever saw." "I'm not," snapped Colin. "I'm not as selfish as your fine Dickon is. He keeps you playing in the dirt when he knows I am all by myself. He's selfish, if you like." Mary's eyes flashed fire. "He's nicer than any other boy that ever lived," she said. He's like an angel." It might sound rather silly to say that, but she did not care. "Ha! A nice angel," Colin sneered ferociously. "He's a common cottage boy off the moor." "He's better than a common Rajah," retorted Mary. "He's 1,000 times better." Because she was the stronger of the two, she was beginning to get the better of him. The truth was that he had never had a fight with anyone like him in his life, and upon the whole, it was rather good for him, though neither he nor Mary knew anything about that. He turned his head on his pillow and shut his eyes, and a big tear was squeezed out and ran down his cheek. He was beginning to feel pathetic and sorry for himself, not for anyone else. "I'm not as selfish as you, because I'm always ill. And I'm sure there is a lump coming on my back," he said. "And I'm going to die besides." "You are not," contradicted Mary unsympathetically. He opened his eyes quite wide with indignation. He had never heard such a thing said before. He was at once furious and slightly pleased, if a person could be both at the same time. "I'm not," he cried. "I am. You know I am. Everybody says so. I don't believe it, said Mary sourly. You just say that to make people sorry. I believe you're proud of it. I don't believe it. If you were a nice boy, it might be true, but you're too nasty. In spite of his invalid back, Colin sat up in bed with quite a healthy rage. Get out of the room, he shouted, and he caught hold of his pillow and threw it at her. He was not strong enough to throw it far, and it only fell at her feet. But Mary's face looked as pinched as a nutcracker. I'm going, she said, and I won't come back. She walked to the door, and when she reached it, she turned round and spoke again. I was going to tell you all sorts of nice things, she said. Dickon brought his fox and his rook, and I was going to tell you all about them. Now I won't tell you a single thing. And she marched out of the room and closed it behind her, and there, to her great astonishment, she found the trained nurse standing as if she had been listening. And more amazing still, she was laughing. She was a big, handsome young woman who ought not to have been a trained nurse at all, as she could not bear invalids, and she was always making excuses to leave Colin to Martha or anyone else who would take her place. And Mary had never liked her, and she simply stood and gazed up at her as she stood giggling into her handkerchief. What are you laughing at? She asked the nurse. At the two young ones, said the nurse. It's the best thing that could happen to the sickly, pampered thing, to have someone to stand up to him that's as spoilt as himself. And she laughed into her handkerchief again. If he'd had a young vixen of a sister to fight him, it would have been the saving of him. Is he going to die? Asked Mary. I don't know. And I don't care, said the nurse. Hysterics and temper are half what ails him. What are hysterics? Asked Mary. You'll find out if you work him into a tantrum after this. But at any rate, you've given him something to have hysterics about, and I'm glad for that. Mary went back to her room, not feeling at all as she had felt when she had come in from the garden. She was cross and disappointed, but not at all sorry for Colin. She had looked forward to telling him a great many things, and she had meant to try to make up her mind whether it would be safe to trust him with the great secret. She had been beginning to think it would be, but now she had changed her mind entirely. She would never tell him, and he could stay in his room and never get any fresh air and die if he liked. It would serve him right. She felt so sour and unrelenting that for a few minutes she almost forgot about Dickon and the green veil creeping over the world and the soft wind blowing down from the moor. Martha was waiting for her, and the trouble in her face had been temporarily replaced by interest and curiosity. There was a wooden box on the table, and its cover had been removed, and revealed that it was full of neat packages. Mr. Craven sent it to you, said Martha. It looks as if it had picture books in it. Mary remembered what he had asked her the day she had gone to his room. Do you want anything? Dolls, toys, books? She opened the package, wondering if he had sent a doll, and also wondering what she would do with it if he had. But he had not sent one. There were several beautiful books, such as Colin had, and 2 of them were about gardens, and were full of pictures. There were 2 or 3 games, and there was a beautiful little writing case with a gold monogram on it, and a gold pen and inkstand. Everything was so nice that her pleasure began to crowd her anger out of her mind. She had not expected him to remember her at all, and her hard little heart grew quite warm. "I can write better than I can print," she said, "and the first thing I shall write with that pen will be a letter to tell him I am much obliged." If she had been friends with Colin, she would have run to show him her presents at once, and they would have looked at the pictures and read some of the gardening book, perhaps tried playing the games, and he would have enjoyed himself so much he would never once have thought about dying or having to put his hand on his spine to see if there was a lump coming. He had a way of doing that which she could not bear. It gave her an uncomfortable, frightened feeling because he always looked so frightened himself. He said that if he felt even quite a little lump some day, he would know his hunch had begun to grow. Something he had heard Mrs. Medlock whispering to the nurse had given him the idea, and he had thought over it in secret until it was quite firmly fixed in his mind. Mrs. Medlock had said his father's back had begun to show its crookedness in that way when he was a child. He had never told anyone but Mary that most of his tantrums, as they called them, grew out of his hysterical, hidden fear. Mary had been sorry for him when he told her that. He always began to think about it when he was cross or tired, she said to herself, and he has been cross today. Perhaps he has been thinking about it all afternoon. She stood still, looking down at the carpet and thinking. I said I would never go back again, then hesitating, knitting her brows. But perhaps, just perhaps, I will go and see, if he wants me, in the morning. Perhaps he'll try to throw his pillow at me again, but I think I'll go. There we go. Chapters 16 and 17. Is that? No, 15 and 16. Losing count. What is it? 15 and 16 of The Secret Garden. Thank you for joining me tonight for the Aurora Bedtime Story Project. I'm Chris Voss. We do this every weeknight right here from the Canopy Room in Somerville, Mass. Bedtime story reading, largely from The Secret Garden for the last couple of weeks. Starting at 9:30 on Facebook Live and also on the YouTube channel. Just search Aurora Bedtime Story Project. And it's been nice to have you along. Nice to have anyone along there on Facebook, on Instagram Live as well. A couple of people joined for a moment or two. So with that, I wish you a very good night. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for the next couple of chapters. There's a tantrum involved for sure. And yeah, have a wonderful rest of your evening. I'll see you tomorrow night.